In 2026, the Vatican controls assets worth billions of euros, properties spanning 121 countries, a bank that operates under its own sovereign laws, a real estate empire that would make Manhattan developers blush. Yet just 2 years ago, this institution faced a €51.2 million deficit that threatened to bring the world's smallest sovereign state to its knees. How did an institution that once sold indulgences to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica transform itself into a modern financial powerhouse? And who really controls its money today? You might think the Vatican operates like a medieval kingdom, with gold coins stacked in underground vaults beneath ancient basilicas. The reality is far more complex, far more modern, and far more dramatic than any conspiracy theory you have ever encountered. Here is what I am going to reveal in this video. First, why Pope Leo XIV reversed his predecessor's entire financial strategy within months of taking power, a move that stunned cardinals and lay employees alike. Second, the true role of the mysterious Institute for the Works of Religion, known as the Vatican Bank, an institution that was sidelined, humiliated, and then resurrected in a single papal document. And third, how a radical shift toward ethical investing did not just save the church from financial ruin, but actually generated a surplus that nobody saw coming. The numbers are staggering when you break them down. A swing from €51.2 million in the red to €1.6 million in the black in a single fiscal year. Donations surging by €20 million to reach €237.6 million. Hospital revenues and real estate income climbing by €79 million. Behind every euro is a story of power, of theological conviction, of backroom deals conducted in marble corridors, where footsteps echo against walls that have witnessed 2 millennia of institutional survival. This is not a story about theology. This is a story about survival. To understand today's Vatican finances, we must first journey back through centuries of wealth accumulation, scandal, and reform. If you are fascinated by the hidden histories of powerful institutions, hit that like button and subscribe for more revelations about the world's most secretive organizations. We dig into the documents so you do not have to. Now, let me take you inside the marble halls where faith meets finance. The Vatican's financial story begins not in a boardroom, but in a theological crisis. For centuries, the Catholic Church accumulated wealth through a system that modern economists would recognize as a diversified revenue model: tithes from parishes across Europe, land grants from monarchs seeking divine favor, fees for sacraments, payments for indulgences, literal certificates promising reduced time in purgatory, which funded some of the most magnificent architecture the world has ever seen. But the real power play was just beginning. By the 20th century, the Vatican had evolved its financial apparatus into something far more sophisticated. 3 institutions formed the backbone of Vatican finance, and understanding their rivalry is essential to understanding everything that follows. The first is the administration of the Patrimony of the Apostolic See, or APSA. Think of APSA as the Vatican's Treasury Department. It manages real estate holdings across the globe, handles investment portfolios, and oversees the day-to-day financial operations of the Holy See. For decades, APSA wielded enormous influence, operating with minimal oversight and maximum autonomy. The second is the Institute for the Works of Religion, the Vatican Bank. Founded in 1942, this institution was designed to manage assets intended for religious works and acts of Christian charity. But buried in paragraph 47 of its founding charter was a bombshell. The bank could accept deposits and make investments with virtually no external regulation. No international banking authority could audit its books. No government could subpoena its records. It operated behind the shield of sovereign immunity, and for decades, that shield protected not just legitimate religious transactions, but operations that would eventually shake the church to its foundations. The third player emerged more recently. The Secretariat for the Economy, created by Pope Francis in 2014, was designed to be the Vatican's financial watchdog. Its mission was to centralize control, impose transparency, and end the era of autonomous financial fiefdoms operating within Vatican walls. Now picture these 3 institutions as rival kingdoms within the world's smallest state. Each controlled billions, each reported to different cardinals, each operated under different rules, and each jealously guarded its territory against the others. The Pope sat above them all, theoretically supreme, but practically dependent on whichever faction provided the most reliable information. And here is the detail that changes everything about how you understand Vatican power. The person who controls the financial information controls the institution, not the theologian, not the diplomat, the accountant. This dynamic created a system where transparency was not just lacking, it was actively resisted. Financial reports were delayed, sanitized, or simply never produced. Investment decisions were made in private meetings, with no minutes recorded. Property transactions occurred through shell companies that even senior cardinals could not trace. Consider what this means for an institution funded by 1.4 billion Catholics worldwide. Every Sunday donation, every Peter's pence collection, every charitable bequest from elderly parishioners, all of it flowed into a system where accountability was treated as an inconvenience rather than an obligation. The smallest country faced the largest crisis of institutional trust in modern religious history, and no one outside the apostolic palace walls truly understood the scale of the problem. But everything changed when the scandals erupted, and the first explosion came from the place least expected. The decade between 2012 and 2022 was not merely embarrassing for the Vatican, it was existential. Scandal after scandal peeled back layers of secrecy that had protected Vatican finances for generations, and what the world saw underneath was deeply troubling. Then something happened that shook the Vatican to its foundations. In 2012, the Vatican Bank's own president was dismissed after Italian prosecutors opened investigations into suspected money laundering. Leaked documents, quickly dubbed Vati leaks, revealed internal correspondence showing cardinals fighting over financial control, investment managers operating without oversight, and millions of euros flowing through accounts with little documentation. The money trail led somewhere nobody expected. It led not to a single corrupt individual, but to a systemic failure. The Vatican's financial architecture was not broken by bad actors. It was broken by design. Decentralized authority, overlapping jurisdictions, and a culture of secrecy that predated the invention of modern banking had created an environment where abuse was not just possible, but inevitable. Then, in 2013, Pope Francis arrived. The Argentine Pope understood something his predecessors had not fully grasped. The financial scandals were not just public relations problems, they were theological problems. How could a church that preached simplicity and charity to the poor justify an opaque financial system that even its own leaders could not fully explain? What followed was not reform but revolution. Francis created the Secretariat for the Economy and appointed Cardinal George Pell, a blunt Australian known for his confrontational style, to lead it. Pell's mandate was clear: centralize everything, audit everything, control everything. But here is what the official reports do not tell you. The centralization campaign met ferocious resistance from within. APSA officials saw their autonomy threatened. Vatican Bank employees feared dissolution. Career bureaucrats who had operated independently for decades suddenly found themselves answering to a new authority they considered illegitimate. The numbers tell a story of their own. During this period, the Vatican's annual budget remained persistently in deficit. Personnel costs climbed 6% year after year as the institution employed over 5,000 people, many of them Italian citizens, with generous employment protections. Real estate holdings across Rome generated revenue, but maintenance costs on centuries-old properties consumed much of the income. Hospital operations, particularly the Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital, required constant financial support. Francis pressed forward. He commissioned external audits for the first time in Vatican history. He brought in consultants from PricewaterhouseCoopers. He demanded consolidated financial statements that combined all Vatican entities into a single, transparent picture. The reaction was swift and shocking. Some departments cooperated grudgingly, others stalled. A few actively obstructed auditors by delaying document production or claiming that certain records fell under pontifical secrecy. The Vatican, it turned out, was not one institution, but dozens of semi-independent entities, each with its own culture, its own financial practices, and its own interpretation of how much transparency the Pope could actually demand. By 2022, a decade of reform had produced real but incomplete results. The Vatican Bank had been cleaned up significantly. Its most problematic accounts had been closed. International monitoring bodies gave cautious approval, but the deeper structural problems remained. The €44 million structural deficit, the gap between what the Vatican spent annually and what it earned through operations, had been identified but not solved. In fact, it had barely been halved from its worst levels. This single decision would echo for decades. Francis chose centralization as his weapon. He believed that concentrating financial authority in one department would impose discipline across the entire institution. He was partially right. The Secretariat for the Economy did force greater transparency. It did produce the first ever consolidated financial statements. It did bring external auditors into Vatican offices for the first time. But centralization also created bottlenecks. Decisions that once took days now took months. Departments that had operated nimbly found themselves paralyzed by approval processes. And most critically, it created a single point of failure. When the Secretariat struggled with its own internal controversies, the entire system slowed. The stage was set for confrontation, not between reformers and traditionalists in the way most observers expected, but between two fundamentally different visions of how a 2,000-year-old institution should manage its earthly fortune. Change was coming from an unexpected source, and his name was Robert Francis Prevost. On May 8, 2025, white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney, and the Catholic world learned it had a new leader. Robert Francis Prevost, an American-born Augustinian who took the name Leo XIV, became the 267th successor of St. Peter. He was the first American pope. He was a former missionary, and he carried with him a financial philosophy that would overturn everything his predecessor had built. But one man saw what others missed. Leo XIV understood that Francis's centralization, while well-intentioned, had created a different kind of dysfunction. By pulling all financial authority into the Secretariat for the Economy, Francis had not eliminated the power struggles. He had merely relocated them. Instead of three rival fiefdoms, there was now one overloaded bureaucracy, surrounded by resentful departments, stripped of their autonomy. The new pope's approach was radically different. Where Francis centralized, Leo would distribute. Where Francis concentrated power, Leo would share responsibility. The theological term he would use was co-responsibility. The financial term was decentralized governance with accountability. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Within weeks of his election, Leo XIV began convening private meetings in the Apostolic Palace. These were not the grand public audiences that cameras captured. These were small gatherings, 6 or 7 people seated around polished wooden tables in rooms where morning light filtered through Renaissance windows, illuminating documents that would reshape Vatican financial architecture. The attendees represented every faction. Representatives from APSA arrived warily, hoping for restoration of their former powers. Vatican bank officials came cautiously optimistic, sensing that their institution might be rescued from the marginalization it had suffered under Francis. Secretariat for the Economy staffers attended with anxiety, knowing that their department's dominance was under review. And lay financial advisors, some recruited from international banking institutions, provided technical expertise that career clerics simply did not possess. What happened in those September 2025 meetings has never been fully reported. But the outcomes speak volumes. Over the course of 3 weeks, Leo XIV listened to every perspective. He reviewed financial statements personally. He asked questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of institutional finance, surprising those who expected a pastoral figure unfamiliar with balance sheets. Then someone noticed the discrepancy. The Vatican's investment portfolio, managed primarily through APSA, had been following ethical investing guidelines that Francis had introduced. These guidelines prohibited investments in weapons manufacturing, fossil fuels, and companies that violated Catholic social teaching. Critics within the Vatican had argued that ethical constraints were costing the institution returns, contributing to the persistent deficit. But the data told the opposite story. Ethical investment funds had actually outperformed the Vatican's previous portfolio in several key metrics. Sustainable energy investments had generated consistent returns. Healthcare and education sector investments aligned with Catholic mission while producing solid financial results. The ethical investing framework was not a burden, it was an advantage. Leo XIV seized on this data. It became the foundation of his reform vision. If ethical investing could generate competitive returns, then the entire argument for opacity, the claim that financial secrecy was necessary to protect investment strategies, collapsed. Transparency and ethics were not obstacles to financial health. They were prerequisites. Little did they know the real crisis was approaching. Even as Leo planned his reforms, the 2023 financial results were being finalized. The deficit had ballooned to €51.2 million. Personnel costs continued their relentless 6% annual climb. The pension system, which covered all Vatican employees, was severely underfunded. Without dramatic intervention, the Vatican faced the possibility of being unable to meet its basic financial obligations within a decade. The urgency transformed Leo's reform from an intellectual exercise into a survival mission. The committee meetings intensified, draft documents circulated through secure Vatican channels. Legal experts examined whether the Pope's supreme authority could override existing financial structures without violating the Vatican's own constitutional framework. The answer, as it always is in the Vatican, was nuanced. The Pope possesses absolute legislative, executive, and judicial authority within Vatican city-state, but exercising that authority against entrenched institutional resistance requires not just legal power but political skill. Popes who have overreached have found their reforms quietly undermined by the very bureaucracy tasked with implementing them. Leo XIV chose a different path. Rather than imposing reforms by fiat, he built consensus. Rather than punishing departments that had resisted Francis's centralization, he invited them into the process. Rather than threatening the Vatican Bank with dissolution, as some Francis-era reformers had advocated, he offered it a restored role with enhanced responsibilities. This wasn't theology. This was survival, and Leo XIV proved to be a remarkably adept institutional politician. By late September 2025, the outlines of the reform were clear to those involved. A new document was being drafted, one that would fundamentally restructure Vatican financial governance. It would redistribute authority, restore institutional autonomy with accountability, create new oversight mechanisms, and for the first time in history, allow Vatican departments to use external banks for certain transactions. The document had a name, Conjuncta Cura, Latin for shared care, and its implications went far beyond money. History pivoted on this papal signature, but the document that would shake St. Peter's Dome still needed final approval, and the debates continued until the very last hour. October 6th, 2025, the day the Vatican entered the modern world. Pope Leo XIV signed the apostolic letter Conjuncta Cura in the early morning hours, seated at the desk in his private study within the Apostolic Palace. The document was 5 typed pages long. It referenced canon law, cited financial best practices from secular governance, and invoked the theological principle of subsidiarity, the idea that decisions should be made at the lowest competent level rather than concentrated at the top. The Vatican's fortune hung on 5 typed pages, and every single page was a calculated act of institutional revolution. Here is where the story becomes truly unprecedented. The document's first provision directly reversed Pope Francis's centralization strategy. Where Francis had concentrated financial oversight in the Secretariat for the Economy, Leo XIV redistributed authority back to individual departments. But this was not a simple restoration of the old system. Each department now operated under strict transparency requirements that had never existed before. They regained autonomy, but they also accepted accountability. The second provision stunned Vatican watchers worldwide. The Institute for the Works of Religion, the Vatican Bank, was not merely preserved, it was elevated. Under Francis, the bank had been marginalized, its role reduced, its future uncertain. Serious voices within the Curia had advocated for its complete dissolution, arguing that the scandals of the previous decade had made it unsalvageable. Leo XIV disagreed completely. Conjuncta Cura restored the Vatican Bank as a central pillar of Vatican financial operations. But this restoration came with revolutionary conditions. The bank would now operate under governance standards comparable to international financial institutions. Its board would include lay professionals with banking expertise. Its transactions would be subject to external audit. And for the first time, its operations would be reported in the Vatican's consolidated financial statements with full transparency. Then came the provision that changes everything about how the Vatican interacts with the global financial system. Conjuncta Cura authorized Vatican departments to open accounts with external banks. For 500 years, Vatican finances had operated exclusively through internal institutions. Money flowed in through Peter's pence collections, through donations, through investment returns, and all of it circulated within a closed system that no external authority could monitor. That era ended with a single document. The age of financial secrecy ended with a single paragraph buried deep in the apostolic letter, granting permission for Vatican entities to conduct certain transactions through regulated commercial banks subject to international banking standards. The implications were earth-shattering for those who understood institutional finance. External banking relationships meant external oversight. Commercial banks operating under European and international regulations would apply anti-money laundering protocols, know your customer requirements, and transaction monitoring standards to Vatican accounts. The Vatican was voluntarily submitting portions of its financial operations to the very regulatory frameworks it had spent centuries avoiding. But here is what the official reports do not tell you about the internal reaction. The signing of Conjuncta Cura produced not celebration, but a complex mixture of relief, anxiety, and calculation within Vatican walls. APSA officials, who had chafed under Francis's centralization, welcomed the restoration of departmental autonomy, but they also recognized that the new transparency requirements were, in some ways, more demanding than the centralized oversight they replaced. Under Francis, they answered to one watchdog. Under Leo, they answered to multiple oversight mechanisms simultaneously. Vatican Bank employees reacted with cautious optimism. Their institution had been saved from the existential threat of dissolution. But the governance reforms meant that the freewheeling culture of previous decades was permanently finished. Professional lay bankers would now sit alongside clerics on the bank's governing board. External auditors would review transactions quarterly rather than annually. The sovereign immunity shield remained in place, but the bank had voluntarily agreed to operate as if it did not exist. What followed would rewrite Vatican history. The Investment Committee, newly restructured under Conjuncta Cura, became the focal point of intense debate. This committee would oversee all Vatican investments, applying ethical guidelines that Leo XIV expanded from Francis's foundation. The committee included cardinals, lay financial experts, and for the first time, representatives from religious orders that had historically managed their own finances independently. The committee's first major decision was to formalize the ethical investing framework that had been producing strong returns. Investments in sustainable energy, healthcare, education, and social housing were prioritized. Investments in weapons, tobacco, fossil fuels, and companies with poor labor practices were explicitly prohibited. But the committee went further. It established positive screening criteria, actively seeking investments that advanced Catholic social teaching while generating competitive financial returns. This single decision would echo for decades. The Vatican was not merely avoiding harmful investments, it was positioning itself as a leader in ethical finance, a move that resonated with younger Catholics and attracted institutional attention from secular investment professionals who were developing similar frameworks. The real revolution was just beginning. Conjuncta Cura also addressed the Vatican's revenue crisis with surgical precision. The document created new mechanisms for coordinating real estate management across the Vatican's global property portfolio. Properties in 121 countries had been managed inconsistently, with some generating strong rental income and others deteriorating through neglect. A new coordinating body would ensure consistent management standards, professional property valuations, and strategic decisions about which properties to maintain, develop, or sell. The hospital system received particular attention. The Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital, the Vatican's flagship medical institution, had been a persistent financial challenge. Conjuncta Cura restructured its governance to include healthcare management professionals alongside the clerical oversight that had traditionally directed the institution. The results would prove dramatic, but the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Buried in the document's provisions about personnel was an acknowledgement that stunned Vatican employees. The pension system was significantly underfunded. For years, the Vatican had promised retirement benefits to its 5,000-plus employees without setting aside adequate reserves to meet those obligations. The structural deficit was not just an operating problem, it was a ticking time bomb of unfunded future liabilities. Conjuncta Cura did not solve the pension crisis, but it acknowledged it publicly for the first time, and it created a framework for addressing it through increased contributions, adjusted benefit calculations, and professional actuarial management. For Vatican employees who had trusted the institution with their retirement security, this revelation was deeply unsettling even as the transparency was welcomed. The financial markets responded with interest rather than alarm. Rating agencies that monitored sovereign debt noted the reforms positively. International banking institutions that had been reluctant to engage with Vatican finances signaled openness to the new framework. The Vatican's financial reputation, tarnished by a decade of scandals, began a slow but measurable recovery. Then the numbers started coming in. The 2024 financial results, the first full year reflected in post-reform accounting, showed something remarkable. The €51.2 million deficit of 2023 had been transformed into a €1.6 million surplus, not through accounting tricks, not through one-time asset sales, through genuine operational improvement driven by the convergence of multiple reform elements. Donations surged to €237.6 million, an increase of 20 million over the previous year. The transparency reforms had produced a tangible trust dividend. Catholics worldwide, seeing the Vatican take financial accountability seriously for the first time, responded with increased generosity. Peter's pence collections, which had declined during the scandal years, stabilized and began to recover. Real estate and hospital revenues climbed by €79 million collectively. Professional management of properties was generating higher rental yields. The hospital system was operating more efficiently. Strategic decisions about the property portfolio, informed by professional valuations rather than clerical intuition, were producing measurable financial returns. The balance sheet that shook St. Peter's Dome was not dramatic in absolute terms. A €1.6 million surplus for an institution managing billions is barely a rounding error. But the symbolic significance was enormous. For the first time in years, the Vatican was not spending more than it earned. The trajectory had reversed. But would these reforms actually work over the long term? The surplus was encouraging, but the structural challenges remained formidable. The 2024 results revealed a Vatican in transition, and the truth was more complex than anyone imagined. Behind the headline surplus figure, deeper currents were running that would determine whether Leo XIV's reforms represented genuine transformation or a temporary reprieve. The donation surge to €237.6 million was real and significant, but financial analysts noted that donation increases often follow major institutional changes before reverting to baseline trends. The question was whether the Vatican could sustain donor confidence over multiple years, particularly as the novelty of reform faded and the harder work of institutional change continued. The €79 million boost from real estate and hospitals was more structurally promising. Property management improvements typically produce sustained returns once professional systems are in place. The hospital efficiency gains reflected operational changes that would compound over time. These were not one-time windfalls, but genuine improvements to the Vatican's revenue-generating capacity. Then they discovered the pension shortfall in its full dimensions. The structural deficit, the gap between recurring revenues and recurring expenses, had been halved, but still stood at approximately €44 million annually. This meant that even with the surplus, the Vatican's underlying financial model remained unsustainable without continued improvement. The institution was running faster, but the finish line kept moving. Personnel costs presented the most intractable challenge. The 6% annual increase in employee expenses reflected not just salary growth but the expanding benefits obligations that came with a workforce of over 5,000 people. Vatican employment, governed by its own labor laws, provided job security and benefits that exceeded Italian public sector standards. Reducing these costs without devastating morale and loyalty was a challenge that no reform document could easily solve. The pension crisis demanded particular attention. Actuarial analyses conducted under the new transparency framework revealed that the Vatican's pension reserves were insufficient to meet projected obligations over the coming decades. This was not unique to the Vatican. Pension underfunding plagues governments and institutions worldwide. But, for an institution that asks its employees to serve out of faith as much as financial compensation, the discovery was particularly painful. Vatican employees responded with a complex mixture of gratitude and anxiety. The transparency was appreciated. For the first time, workers could see the true financial position of their employer, but what they saw was concerning. Many had accepted below-market salaries in exchange for perceived job security and reliable pensions. The revelation that pension promises might not be fully honored shook the implicit social contract that had sustained Vatican employment for generations. The real Vatican fortune is not gold, it is control, and Conjuncta Cura had fundamentally redistributed that control. Departments that had been stripped of financial autonomy under Francis now managed their own budgets again, but under oversight mechanisms that made every transaction visible. The Vatican Bank, restored to prominence, operated under governance standards that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The Secretariat for the Economy, its monopoly broken, refocused on coordination and analysis rather than direct control. This redistribution created new dynamics. Departments competed for resources through transparent budgeting processes rather than through backroom negotiations. Investment decisions were debated in committee meetings, with minutes recorded and circulated. Property transactions required documented appraisals and competitive bidding processes. The comparison with corporate governance was instructive. Secular corporations had undergone similar transitions from founder-controlled enterprises to professionally managed institutions with distributed governance. The Vatican was essentially experiencing in compressed time a transformation that publicly traded companies had undergone over decades. The growing pains were real, but predictable. External observers noted that the reforms remained incomplete in important ways. While transparency had improved dramatically, the Vatican still did not publish the level of financial detail that comparable institutions provided. Consolidated financial statements were produced, but certain entities remained partially outside the reporting framework. The sovereign immunity that protected Vatican finances from external legal proceedings remained fully intact. Money does not lie, but financial statements can present selective truths. The 2024 surplus, while genuine, reflected a year in which multiple favorable factors aligned. Donation increases, property revenue gains, and hospital efficiency improvements all contributed simultaneously. Whether that alignment would persist was an open question. The future remained dangerously uncertain. Climate change threatened Vatican properties in flood-prone areas. Demographic shifts in traditionally Catholic countries suggested long-term declines in donation revenue. The pension obligations would grow as the workforce aged. And the global economic environment, with its cycles of expansion and contraction, would inevitably test the resilience of reforms designed during a period of relative stability. But the numbers told only part of the story. The deeper transformation was cultural. For the first time in modern history, Vatican financial officials operated under the assumption that their decisions would be reviewed, questioned, and publicly reported. This shift in institutional psychology, from secrecy as default to transparency as expectation, may prove more consequential than any specific provision of conjuncta cura. The smallest country had confronted its largest crisis and emerged, if not triumphant, then at least transformed. The question was no longer whether the Vatican could reform its finances. It was whether the reforms would prove durable enough to survive the inevitable pressures of institutional inertia, economic uncertainty, and the next crisis that nobody yet anticipated. We began this video with a question: who really controls the Vatican's money? The answer, it turns out, is not a secret family. It is not a shadowy cabal of bankers operating behind medieval walls. The real answer is simultaneously more mundane and more fascinating. The Vatican's fortune is controlled by the same forces that shape every institution on earth: competing bureaucracies, institutional inertia, the tension between transparency and tradition, the eternal struggle between those who want to preserve power and those who want to distribute it. Pope Leo XIV's conjuncta cura did not solve every problem. It did not eliminate the structural deficit. It did not fully fund the pension system. It did not transform a 2,000-year-old institution into a model of corporate transparency overnight. What it did was establish a framework in which solutions became possible. It replaced the question of whether the Vatican should be transparent with the question of how transparent it could become. This is how an ancient institution learns to survive, not through dramatic rupture with the past, but through careful adaptation that honors tradition while acknowledging reality. The Vatican of 2026 still operates behind walls built in the 16th century, but the financial information flowing within those walls moves with a speed and transparency that would astonish the popes who built them. The ethical investing framework that Leo expanded from Francis's foundation points toward a future where the Vatican's financial operations actively embody its theological mission. When a Catholic institution invests in sustainable energy, healthcare access, and social housing, the money itself becomes a form of ministry. The returns fund the Church's operations, while the investments advance its teachings. This alignment of mission and money represents perhaps the most significant philosophical shift in Vatican financial history. Consider what €237.6 million in donations actually means. It means that Catholics worldwide, informed by unprecedented transparency, chose to increase their giving. Trust, it turns out, is the most valuable asset the Vatican possesses. More valuable than Roman real estate, more valuable than Renaissance art, more valuable than any investment portfolio. And trust is the one asset that cannot be managed by committees or protected by sovereign immunity. It must be earned continuously through honest dealing and transparent reporting. Now you understand why Leo XIV had no choice but to act. The Vatican's financial survival depended not on finding new revenue sources, but on rebuilding the trust that decades of secrecy and scandal had eroded. Conjuncta Cura was not primarily a financial document. It was a trust document. Every provision, from external banking access to enhanced oversight to pension transparency, served the fundamental purpose of demonstrating that the institution entrusted with the faith of 1.4 billion people could also be trusted with their money. The balance sheet that shook St. Peter's Dome told a simple story, from deficit to surplus, from secrecy to transparency, from centralized control to shared responsibility. Whether that story continues in the chapters ahead depends on whether the Vatican can maintain the institutional courage that reform demands. October 6, 2025, was not the end of the Vatican's financial transformation. It was the beginning, and the world, for the first time, is watching with the lights on. The real secret of Vatican finances was never a family, a conspiracy, or a hidden fortune. It was the slow, painful, profoundly human struggle to bring an ancient institution into the modern world, and that story is still being written.